Hello everyone, and welcome back to another instalment of our long-running webinar series. Are you ready to eliminate the risk of greenwashing from your circular economy strategies? In this webinar, we have Jim Goddin and Walter Jager, who both helped develop the newly published ISO standards. They will explain how the standards support businesses to implement and measure circular economy strategies effectively. Let's get into it.
Welcome to today's webinar on the new circular economy ISO standards, how to stamp out greenwashing risk. I'm Jim Goddin. I'm the head of circular economy here at thinkstep-anz, and I have the pleasure today to be joined by Walter Jager, who is principal consultant of ECG compliance. Walter has continued to contribute to international standards in environmental compliance, circular and eco design, and he's vice chair of the IEC TC 111 on environmental standardization for EE products and systems. He holds a master's degree in electrical engineering and business administration and has held positions in design engineering, quality and reliability engineering, product management, supply chain management, and environmental compliance and sustainability. And he's also been a great partner in crime and collaborator over the last 4 years as these standards have taken shape. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the webinar today. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to go through 3 standards. This is quite an ambitious call, really, because there's an awful lot of content to cover. So we're going to do a double act. We'll get started. So I've drawn the straw of working through ISO 59 and 59010. So we'll go through those in relatively rapid order, and we'll take questions at the end. So ISO 59004 really deals with the vocabulary, principles and guidance for implementation of the circular economy. It defines what the circular economy is, what its vision is, what we're trying to achieve, what the main principles of the circular economy are, and importantly, how it can be implemented. So it establishes a common vocabulary, which is an essential frame of reference when we talk about circularity, because there are many different perspectives on what circular economy is and what it means. And this at least gives us a bit of consistency in terms of how we talk about it. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the definitions, but I thought it'd be useful to go through what the definition of a circular economy is from the perspective of this standard. And in the eyes of the standard, it is an economic system that uses a systemic approach to maintain a circular flow of resources by recovering, retaining, or adding to their value while contributing to sustainable development. Now, those bits of text in bold are additional branches out to additional definitions. So when we talk about economic systems, we're talking about a system by which society organizes and allocates resources. When we talk about the circular flow of resources, we're talking about systemic cycling of the provision and use of resources within multiple technical or biological cycles. When we talk about value, we're talking about the gains or benefits from satisfying needs and expectations in relation to the use and conservation of resources. So this is really focusing on the value rather than the resources themselves. And when we talk about sustainable development, this is quite a familiar definition for a lot of us in terms of development that meets the environmental, social, and economic needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, you'll see within each of those sub-definitions, we also talk about resources a lot. And a resource is an asset from which a solution is created or implemented, and it includes any energy type. So that's the energy content of materials or the energy potential in materials. So this gives you an idea really of the focus of this standard, and there are many more definitions within this which we're not going to cover today, but you can pick up from the standard itself. So this gives us a common definition of what the circular economy actually means, and behind that there are the 6 principles that we're trying to focus on within the circular economy. These have to be taken together. We can't pick and choose which ones we focus on. And that's part of the systemic or holistic approach that underpins the circular economy. So these include systems thinking, value creation, value sharing, resource stewardship, resource traceability, and ecosystems resilience. And if we explode that out a little bit further, we can see some of the categories that sit within each of those principles. So when we talk about systems thinking, we're talking about adopting a life cycle perspective. We're looking at things like risk management and resilience, social impacts, a long-term approach. If we're looking at value creation, we're looking at procurement and sourcing, innovation and design, adding value to resources or efficient use of resources. Value sharing, we're talking about stakeholder engagement, policy and regulatory compliance, transparency and inclusivity. Resource stewardship, we talk about things like economic rationalization, risk and opportunity management, the use of circular economy metrics, which Walter will talk about in a few minutes. Resource traceability includes collecting and maintaining data on resource flows. Transparency, again, circularity metrics and reporting. And ecosystem resilience includes things like protecting and regenerating ecosystems and preventing harmful losses and releases. Now, together, these all link into the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are multiple examples of how these link together. I'm not going to go through all of those linkages, and undoubtedly there will be other linkages that are not displayed on this diagram. But just to say that there are strong linkages with all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and so by focusing on these principles, we can really focus on how the delivery of a circular economy system helps to deliver those Sustainable Development Goals. The implications of the principles really are that it defines the scope of what we need to be considering as businesses, in that we need to be considering these principles early in design and throughout the development process. Again, we have to consider them collectively, and it encourages us to adopt a life cycle perspective, looking at the interdependencies and the cumulative impacts across the use of our products, highlighting opportunities to collaborate and to improve transparency and traceability. And also, importantly, defining links to risk management, whether that's through the use of hazardous substances, the environmental impacts, equity within our business model, and our impacts on biodiversity. And it also links, as I said, to use of metrics to monitor stocks and flows. And that's what we'll be covering in the ISO standard later on. Through implementation, we're trying to understand the circularity of our current system, the value models that exist, and the risks that go with that, to identify opportunities to increase circularity, and then leveraging interactions along the value chain, including those in other sectors, to really help us to deliver a model that delivers value and not just circularity for its own sake. And as part of that, we're encouraged to consider things like upcoming legislation, economics, our users and markets. So just in summary for ISO 59004, it's really how we talk about circular economy and what we need to consider when developing our strategy for how we're going to deliver a more circular model within our business. Now, linking to the standard, we have ISO 59010, which is more about the transition of business model value networks. So it's a guidance document really for how a business can adopt the circular economy and transition from a linear model to a more circular one. Now, the scope of this model is really around this flow diagram. It starts off with setting goals and boundaries, so understanding where our current business is and who we need to include within the scope of a circular economy model. From that, determining a strategy and looking at the transition both of our business model and our value network. So all the businesses that are linked to our model, how we transition those to a greater level of circularity, and then coming back to a process of continuous improvement through reviewing and monitoring our progress against the metrics that we're using. So I'm just going to go through those individual steps in a bit more detail. So if looking at setting goals and boundaries, we're looking at what we want to achieve through the circular economy model, because that helps us to guide our vision and helps us to set measurable targets. Without this, we don't really know where we are and where we're trying to go. To do that, we need to understand our current model and the value network. We need to know where value is created for stakeholders to guide goal setting and to map the value chain and network of flows. And that provides context in terms of the collaborators we need to bring on board, the sort of things we need to look at as enablers that may not be part of circularity itself, but may enable circularity, what sort of barriers we may have to overcome, either individually or collectively. And again, to focus on who and what is within the boundary of our assessment. Setting those boundaries allow us to address circularity. It defines the scope of who we're trying to influence and what we're trying to influence. And in some cases where we're having to work with competitors or within industry groups, it helps us to understand the need for additional governance measures, whether we need to set up an association or a pact that helps us to define and measure common goals. And key to behind all that is understanding the current level of circularity performance. So this really sets the starting point for progress, and it's something that we encourage lots of companies to do, is to really understand how much circularity they already have in order to understand how much they can improve and where they should be trying to go to, and where they should be prioritizing development. And from that, we can consider the types of circular economy actions we can take and understand how different actions can influence on the goals we want to achieve. Through all this, there is a strong focus on the economic rationale behind the circular economy. That is a key starting point for this model, because unless we have a strong economic rationale for why we're transitioning to a circular economy, it's very difficult to justify actually making those changes to transition. So understanding what the value network is, what value we're trying to deliver, and how we as businesses can benefit from the implementation of circular economy models is a key component of this. So in terms of determining strategy, we're encouraged to identify gaps and opportunities, to look at the links to goals and boundaries and the value chains, and also the 6 principles. Commonly, we find those align with the business value, the mission and purpose, and that might be captured within a materiality assessment. If you've done one already, if you haven't, it's a good materiality assessment is a good place to start to understand what it is that's important to your business and to your stakeholders. And as I said, it helps to address that economic rationale. How will the transition be justified and bankrolled? How does it enable you to compete with others on the market, or to contend with regulation or supply risks? Supply risks is a big area that we see coming through, particularly with the recent issues around access to materials and new market entrants who might come in with a circular model at their heart. Moving on to the transitioning of the business model towards circularity, it encourages us to develop a plan for delivery, including a roadmap and KPIs, milestones, sequencing, responsibilities. How will you know whether you're succeeding or not? Commonly, the focal point is to use a pilot project, and then to review that model in light of changes. So as you progress through the delivery of your circular economy program, how can you reevaluate your value proposition, the activities you're engaging in, the resources you need? How can you scale your process to moving from a pilot to a larger scale? How does that influence your marketing channels and your opportunities to engage with your users? Are there additional costs or revenue streams that you need to consider, or partnerships that you need to take on board? Are there additional resources or infrastructures or technologies that you need to account? When we look at the value chain and transitioning that towards circularity, establishing shared objectives, a strategy and plan, it facilitates a unified approach. We need to look at things like industrial symbiosis and shared KPIs, opportunities for mutual benefits. Is there a need for governance? As I said, do we need a forum or an alliance or a consortium? We've seen the plastic pacts working very effectively in this sense to address some of the circular economy challenges around packaging. And how do you leverage or establish shared infrastructures? We're seeing the emergence of digital product passports, the need for data exchange. Are there physical infrastructure that's needed in terms of warehousing used components? Are there needs to upskill or add knowledge to our workforce so they know how to deal with these models? And off the back of that, we then have that process of continuous improvement. We're not going to achieve a perfect circular system overnight. This is an ongoing process of identifying opportunities and continuing to pursue greater levels of circularity where it makes sense. And part of the value of doing that and repeatedly measuring and assessing where we are is to understand whether our circularity model is working, whether it's achieving the results we need. And key to that are the metrics that we'll discuss in just a minute. Are there opportunities to improve our business model as we go through? If we can see the level of circularity that we're delivering and the metrics we're using drifting from what we would expect, are there opportunities to adjust our business model or to evaluate or validate what it is that we've actually done? Can we identify additional opportunities and additional interventions? Can we expand the network that we've included within our boundaries? Are there opportunities to grow trust or to increase diversity? Is the level of governance still appropriate? So all these things are things we're encouraged to consider as part of this continuous improvement process. And together within the ISO 59010 standard, provides us with a process as a business to transition from linear to circular and to focus in on that process of continuous improvement. So I'm now going to stop and hand over to Walter, who will take you through the last of the 3 standards at hopefully a slightly more leisurely pace than I've had to go through the first 2. Over to you, Walter.
Thank you very much, Jim, and it's a pleasure to join you on the webinar here today. So thank you for the invitation. We'll be walking through the bit of a sort of a high-level introduction to the 59020 Circular Economy Standard on measuring and assessing circularity performance. Let's move to the next slide, please. Just quickly about ECD compliance. I'm the principal consultant of ECD compliance and had founded the company. We provide consulting and technical support on global environmental regulations in a variety of different ways, circular economy being a key area, substance restrictions, education training, providing support, awareness of environmental standards, environmentally conscious design, circular economy, and eco-label and sustainability programs. I'll keep that short there. If anybody wants more information, they're most welcome to contact me. ISO 59020 on measuring and assessing circularity. So this draws from the baseline that's been put in place by 59004 and the various definitions that are there. And it provides information into 59010 with regard to business models and how to look at current circularity levels, impacts associated with those, and opportunities for improvements going forward. The standard provides a framework to guide users within organizations through the measurement and assessment process with regard to circularity, including setting system boundaries, choosing indicators, identifying what appropriate indicators might be, and then trying to create meaningful and verifiable results. It is applicable to 4 different system levels for measuring circularity. Regional level, which can be a city, it can be a country, it can be the entire planet as well. Something at a higher social level. Interorganizational, this is particularly important for systems that involve industrial symbiosis, for example, individual organizations, and individual products as well. A lot of what has been put into this standard has probably been a little bit more vetted from a product and organizational level than necessarily at the country level. But the intention is to be able to roll up the information across those different system levels. The circularity assessment part of the title, the assessing circularity, looks at the social, environmental, and economic impacts caused by actions to achieve circularity, and it uses complementary methods associated with doing that, other standards that are already out there to look at impacts. It does leverage the principles that were identified within ISO 59004 and adds 2 additional principles to it relevant to measuring circularity. One of those is identifying relevant boundaries for the measurement, and the other is developing meaningful outcomes to the results of the circularity measurement. Next slide, please. So the framework for measuring and assessing circularity, it's pictured by the 3 boxes here. It provides a very similar framework to what you might see in a life cycle assessment. For example, if you're familiar with LCA. There's a boundary setting, that's step 1. That actually includes the setting the goal and scope of the measurement, quality requirements associated with the measurement, setting the temporal and spatial boundaries associated with the boundary for measuring, and then identifying the resource flows into and out of the system based on those boundaries. The spatial and temporal boundaries are particularly important to consider with regard to doing circularity measurement of products, because if you're looking at a circularity measurement, you want to be looking at the entire life cycle of that product. So that spatial boundary for that product can actually go up into your supply chain and go out through the users and potentially to recyclers as well. And the temporal boundary would cover that entire use phase of the product as well. So if you have a 10-year product lifetime, that spatial boundary covers that time period. That doesn't mean you need to wait 10 years in order to do the measurement, but that's what you're projecting towards with regard to how you're setting the boundary and conditions associated with your measurement. Step 2 is the actual circularity measurement itself. I'll dive into that a little bit more in the next slide. Step 3 is using complementary methods, other standards to assess and account for changes to the environmental, social, and economic impacts associated with the actions that are being taken. So you've got examples here of complementary methods associated with life cycle assessment, water analysis, life cycle costing, etc. And the standard actually identifies a number of areas of appropriate complementary methods and assessment methods to be using. Next slide, please. So the circularity measurement and data acquisition process steps, this is that step 2 in that previous slide. We've got the boundary setting at the beginning, then getting into the actual circularity measurement and data acquisition. The organization is selecting what it feels are appropriate circularity indicators based on the goal and scope of the measurement. It's identifying the information to be measured, exactly which flows would be measured there, acquiring that data. Is that data, was the data successfully acquired? There could be, based on the quality of the data, for example, and you may be looking at both primary and secondary data. You may need to revise your selection of the circularity indicators. And if the data was successfully acquired, you calculate your indicators associated with that, and that then takes you into the final phase of the circularity assessment, looking at those impacts using other standards and the reporting. And there are specific reporting requirements identified within the standard. Next slide, please. So the circularity indicators themselves, the work group that developed the ISO 59020 standard did investigate, review over 100 different circularity indicator systems that are currently in use, looked for the ones that had good levels of adoption, tried to understand why they were being adopted, what were the key advantages associated with them. We did want to develop circularity indicators that were practical to use. They would provide good specifications with regard to sort of clarity of what's being measured, but ones that were practical to move forward with and would create a baseline with regard to circularity indicators. All of the different indicators in these different indicator systems were all then compiled. You can see the pie chart on the far right-hand side. That was an analysis done actually by Jim of the 100 different circularity indicator systems we looked at, what they were trying to address, what types of flows, other types of quantitative versus qualitative indicators, et cetera. And from that, we identified 5 categories of core circularity indicators for measurement: resource inflows, resource outflows, energy inflows and outflows, water circularity, inflows, recirculation, outflows, and economic indicators. Next slide, please. And I think I'm going to need to go through these relatively quickly based on the amount of time that we've got, Jim. On the resource inflow side, here you've got 3 indicators. These are all mandatory indicators to do, looking at reused content, recycled content, and renewable content. Some of these were very carefully defined because some of these are also areas that have seen a lot of greenwashing in the past, and we wanted to be careful with regard to how this was specified. The general intention is the 3 of these, when you add them together, you get the circularity content that is going into the system that is being measured, and the remaining portion is the percentage that is a virgin non-renewable content that is not considered to be circular, and that's 100% of your resource inflow. The next slide, the resource outflow. We do have one optional indicator here looking at stretching the loop with regard to circularity, then that is extending the lifetime of products and materials. This is a bit of a challenge for many types of products where there really is no baseline with regard to average material life. This is something that will see a significant development over time, but is important with regard to keeping resources, keeping products in use for as long as possible, so there's less need for new resources being consumed, new products being brought into the marketplace. And that does require a change in mentality with regard to our economic business models as well. On the outflow side, we've got, again, 3 mandatory indicators, one looking at reuse of products or components, one looking at the actual recycled material that's derived from the outflow, and another looking at recirculation of the outflow back into the biological cycle. A lot of discussion and careful wording associated with that in the document itself. And again, those 3 mandatory ones, when you add them together, that is the circular outflow from the organization as identified by its boundary conditions. Next slide. We've also got the energy, water, economic. These are all optional core circularity indicators. We do find that they are often used. They are very important from a circular economy perspective, which is why they're in here, the energy one being renewable energy. One thing I will point out here is that we do also have a number of other non-core, or what we call additional indicators. They're listed in a separate annex, Annex B of the standard, and they are other emerging areas or ones that are not as well developed. And when you are selecting indicators, you should be looking at all of the core circularity indicators, but you may need others that are important based on your goal and scope of your circularity measurement as well. And that's stated in the standard. Next slide, please. So circularity indicators should be selected based on significance to the system that is being measured. Combination of indicators selected should cover the full circular loop of all of the resources that are flowing within the system. There may be others, circularity indicators that might be selected as well. That supplements the core circularity indicators. And measurement is conducted based on the system boundary that is set at the beginning of the process. Next slide, please. A process for measuring the circularity of the product or organization is coming out of 5902, and assessing the impact and benefits of circularity and ongoing improvements coming out of that standard. So two key takeaways there that 59020 is providing. And I think we can now go into Q&A.
And we have got some really good questions coming through on the Q&A. So I guess let's just start with the first one from Rick Walters. Do you think that the ISO definitions of circular economy focus on circulation at all costs, or recognize that in some cases linearity may be less cool than circularity, at least with current technologies? So that's a good thought-provoking question. Do you want to take that one, Walter?
I would be happy to. I saw it come up on the screen early in the presentation here, and it's actually a really good question, and it does come up a fair bit as well. The intention here is not that circularity does not come at all costs here. You need to look at it in a balanced way. It is a risk associated with implementing various circularity actions. And that's why it's so important to do the circularity assessment, to look at what the impacts are associated with the circularity actions that you're taking. You need to do this with your eyes wide open. Essentially, there is a risk, but the social, the environmental considerations here are built into the standards as well to be taken into account. Do you have anything else to add to that, Jim?
No, I very much agree. I think it's generally circularity itself isn't what we're pursuing. It's the benefits of circularity, and we need to be mindful of what benefits we're seeking. And I think 59010 really directs us to understand what we are trying to deliver from the circular economy model, and to treat that holistically. And there will be cases where the circular economy model we're looking at doesn't make sense, or doesn't make sense now. So we also need to be mindful of that temporal aspect that you mentioned earlier, that some of the systems we rely on will change over the coming years as we decarbonize energy and transport, which means there may be tipping points between different types of circularity, and we need to understand where those exist. Another question we had through from Steph Rich: for businesses looking to implement these standards, what are the biggest challenges that you are seeing? Do you have a comment on that from your side, Walter? I think a few challenges.
I think one of the big challenges there is in really identifying the different flows that are relevant, measuring them in such a way that they're not being overestimated, and the fact that for many of these circularity areas, the ability to get the information isn't there yet. Like one of the things we're looking at with regard to recycled content, or a recycled material, you really want how much recycled material is coming out of your products or out of your organizations. That may be dependent on what recycling technologies are 5 or 10 years down the road. So we need to use current knowledge, methods, treatment scenarios in order to figure that out, but do it in a way where it's conservative, as opposed to just looking at potential recyclability. That's one particular example. So the availability of the data is going to be a big challenge here, but this is going to be an area where we're slowly seeing this become more prevalent.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think that data is a perennial challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity for collaboration, and for particularly collaboration between organizations and regional bodies. We do still depend on recycling infrastructure if we're going down the recycling route. I think, though, part of the challenge is also the ongoing perception that the circular economy is recycling, and actually the circular economy is a lot more than that, and that's why it's really good to see those components of reuse and durability brought into ISO 59020, because it really does open the opportunity for greater levels of circularity for products that are actually hard to recycle, or which may struggle to find appropriate recycled content for. Through product life extension and reuse, there are avenues to enhance the circularity. And we had a question which I answered in the chat about narrowing some of the loops and decoupling from reducing the amount of material we consume, and those loops of durability and reuse are really focused on that. So I think we'll take one more question perhaps before we leave you to answer our survey. And perhaps this is a good one for you again, Walter. In terms of ISO 59020, how does it interact with ISO 14001 and environmental management systems?
Question there. The One general question that exists right now is the interplay between environmental management systems and circular economy, because there's obviously quite a bit of overlap between the two of them. Circular economy provides a tool in order to reduce environmental impacts, social impacts, etc. So it has a bit of a broader opportunity base there. The 59020 allowing you to do circularity measurement that can fit into your 1401 environmental objectives, and it gives you a mechanism then to look at how you're potentially reducing various different environmental impacts as well, because that's coming out of those complementary methods that are being used in the circular assessment. So I think 59020 does provide a tool with regard to actually meeting 14,001 management system objectives.
Yeah, I think it is really good to see the links drawn between the standard and the other ISO standards, particularly in the ISO 14000 series. It's certainly a starting point for the material circularity indicator when we developed that. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We already have established systems for measuring the environmental impacts of products. It's really how do we complement that with a measure of circularity that it can be used as part of that holistic picture. And I guess coupled to that is the question we've had in the chat in terms of what tools can do this analysis that cover the core indicators. There are obviously a couple of indicators out there that already cover the mandatory core indicators, and in fact use the same optional core indicator, and those are the material circularity indicator by the other MacArthur Foundation and circular transition indicators by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. If you want to play with the material circularity indicator, there's a free version on our website, which you're welcome to download. But we're already seeing these indicators embedded in LCA tools. So most of the main LCA packages have the material circularity indicator, which again just illustrates how it sits nicely alongside a lot of those environmental assessments. So I think we'll stop the questions there. We will try and answer the remaining questions because there are many really good questions. We'll try and answer those in the follow-up to this webinar. I do thank you for those great examples and those great questions that you've posed. There's far too many for us to get through today, and I would encourage you, as I said, to stick around for the next few minutes just to answer a brief survey. And I'd like to take the opportunity to again thank Walter Jager for joining us on this webinar. It's been a great pleasure to collaborate with him on presenting the work over the last 4 years. It's been a great experience, and looking forward to speaking to you all more in due course as you get started on your journey of using these standards. Thank you very much. Thanks, Walter.
Thank you, Jim. It was a pleasure.
We have many more webinars on our website on a whole host of sustainability topics.